you've done so much, as I can see over the years. You've gone through like a number of different kind of career changes as well. Maybe can
Yeah.
you summarize that for us in about, 2 minutes?
Yeah. I think the way I would describe myself as a startup mentor. I help business to business tech founders who struggle with selling, who are uncomfortable with selling, to figure out a path to predictable recurring revenues by teaching them kind of how to focus and structure and scale their various sales and marketing operations. And what makes, I think, my approach a bit unusual, and this is in reference to my professional background, is I have kind of two very different experiences or sets of experiences or mindsets that I can combine. So I've done 20 years in the corporate world. I was kind of in big global roles in the media industry. So I was senior vice president of global sales at NBC Universal International, overseeing a multiple $100 million business. I've closed about $2 billion worth of B2B deals over the course of my career. So it's got that one side, but I've actually also launched my own business. I've sold a tech company. I've been an investor and in multiple exits. And so I kind of understand the difficulties of creating something from nothing. And so kind of combining those two mindsets, I think, makes my approach somewhat unique.
Zoltan, a question I had was like, so you're working sort of like, big enterprise sales at that stage in your career. Was there a point where you thought, hey, you know what, I kind of want to go to the early end of the business spectrum and give back and help early stage founders? What was it that made you feel like that? Because obviously it's a big change, right?
Yeah, it is. Although I if you look at my career path, I've had various stages where I've kind of gone off track, left behind the corporate world to launch my own business. So I was part of that first big .com boom back in the late 90s. I teamed up with a co-founder and we launched a web portal network in Central and Eastern Europe, which we were able to sell. And I've had some various stages where I've kind of left the corporate world to do some angel investing. This last time for me, it was really not just a sidetrack. It was a fundamental decision I made about changing the trajectory of my professional career. I'd sort of spent, kind of that last 4 or 5 years in this sort of very big corporate environment, getting sucked up in the matrix, so to speak. And I just decided I had enough, I kind of move on. So, I decided that I wanted to get back into helping some, entrepreneurs bring their dreams to life. And so, one of the interesting things I found was that these founders I started working with were extremely knowledgeable, technically very passionate about the products, right? They were really into what they were doing, but they just didn't have the slightest clue about how to sell and market their product. Mm-hmm. They struggled with explaining effectively why somebody should buy what they're selling. They didn't have a sales process in place. They didn't set targets. They didn't track their performance. Like all the stuff you kind of learn in, 20 years of just doing this day to day, they didn't have. And so it didn't take me long to realize that they really needed to have some sort of blueprint or structure to follow because they didn't have anything, they didn't have a path, right? And, the default situation in the case of these companies is usually one or two things, right? One is the I know a guy approach, right? I know somebody here and there and, we'll do business with them. Or, I know, my uncle did business with this company. I'm sure we can get a meeting and do business, right? So it's extremely personal. And on the other spectrum is this spray and pray approach, right? Where they send out 1,000 emails and pray that somebody's going to answer. And, the problem is none of those is really scalable, right? And so what I actually did is I started piecing together all these bits and pieces of everything I'd learned, all the principles, the tools, the techniques, and I packaged it into the system, this 3-pillar system that I call the launch code. And that's kind of what I share through personal mentoring programs, through group workshops, through online on-demand course with these founders now, I guess, numbering over 200 from 25 countries.
Nice. That's formidable. Fantastic stuff. I'm almost getting the vibe that it's like you feed off that mentality as well. You like that mentality of the entrepreneurial zeal that the younger people are bringing. So it's like you give them skills and experience, and you're almost getting that energy and spirit in return.
Absolutely, I think you hit the nail on the head. One of the things you have when you're in kind of a very structured corporate environment is that you're put into a box, right? And everybody's got their little box, and you're basically paid to do a very good job within that little box. So there's not a lot of encouragement of innovation, despite what a lot of companies talk about externally. And so, you are surrounded by extremely well qualified, smart people who basically aren't allowed to do very much. And, you get into this environment where, the sky is the limit. Literally, the whole notion of creating something from nothing is infinite. And I found myself speaking to people in, I'm just thinking of my clientele. I mean, I've got a German ag tech company I work with. I've got a UK-based AI robotics company I work with. I work with B2B SaaS companies across Central and Eastern Europe. So it's just such a mix of people. And what is a common thread is they all have created this idea of solving a problem in some new, unique way. And I think that's a really exciting thing to be around. And it's also an exciting thing to help bring to life.
Yeah, it's like a fundamental tenet of entrepreneurship and business as a whole, right? It's something that I think a lot of early stage entrepreneurs learn that, hey, the market has no emotion, but it does have problems. If you can solve the problems, then you got something here. But just because you really want to be an entrepreneur, that's not a good enough reason.
Absolutely. And I talk about that so much. The problem solution connection sits at the heart of building a business. If there's no problem, then there's nothing for you to solve. And until you find that connection, you don't really achieve product market fit. And I think, one of the interesting insights I've gotten is that sometimes articulating the problem and the solution in a way that your target customer can understand is perhaps one of the biggest first hurdles you have to get over. Right. I mean, so often I have this experience all the time. I go to events all the time. I speak at events. I'm, a panelist or, in some capacity. People come up to me afterwards. And just recently there was a guy, comes up to me and says, hey, I'm building a business. And then he's string of, all the buzzwords, AI, hyper automation, blah, blah, blah. And we're going to take down Facebook and Google because they really are shit, aren't they? So, and it's just like you sit there and say, okay, well, first of all, I don't really understand what you do. And second of all, if your objective is to take down Facebook and Google, I think it's a great aspiration, but that's not why you should be building a company, right? So, just being able to articulate in one simple sentence. My litmus test is: can you explain to an intelligent 12-year-old what problem you solve, for who, and why you're better than the competition? If you can do that in one sentence, I think you're already halfway there.
Yeah. What I find interesting, Zoltan, is that you speak to a lot of people, especially kind of American entrepreneurs, and there's almost this culture of like, head in the sky thinking like you can't dream big enough. I'm going to go for the biggest idea, the biggest market out there. And what I've learned as well, speaking to people like yourself who used to work in corporations, is that you bring a lot of that kind of level-headedness and that kind of structure that's required to building a company. It's not all just kind of sunshine, rainbows, dancing around, having fun, company swag, free meals and all of this. It's actually about creating structure, creating a plan, creating a business model. That's something I personally learned in the last year or so. Would you echo that in terms of kind of a lot of entrepreneurs not quite getting that? And that's really where your value add is?
So 2 points there. The one that I think is really important is this concept of structure, right? So structure is an interesting thing, right? If you perceive structure as being limiting, then it can be something that keeps you demotivated or unwilling to take a significant strides in the right direction. I actually think that structure creates freedom, right? Because if you can create a system that you then can follow in a reasonably structured manner or approach, it actually frees you up to not worry about the day-to-day kind of bits and pieces, but to be much more creative. And so that's actually what I do with the launch code, right? So that the first pillar is focus your offer message, right? So it's, what's your value proposition? What's your product offering? And what's your messaging? These are the three things you just have to get down to be able to create a focused offer message. Then we move into how do you create a structured sales model, right? So outbound sales, inbound marketing, and partnerships. How do you create those pieces, those pillars, so that you just have a repetitive process that you implement? And then finally, the third piece, which actually is sometimes the most difficult for entrepreneurs to understand, is moving away from the concept of intuitive thinking to much more data-based decision making, right? When you're like tracking your results, you're managing your performance, you're building a team to bring that to life. So that structure is something that I think adds a tremendous amount of value to early stage businesses. To your point about the U.S. Kind of sky in the clouds thing, I have an interesting story. So one of the clients I worked with is a Finnish woman and her team, they were kind of putting together technology to create highlight reels from sports in a very quick manner, in a few minutes, using AI. And she joined a US, I think it was an Austin-based accelerator virtually. And I don't know if you've ever met anybody from Finland, but they're not the biggest, most outgoing people in the world. I mean, there's a reason why text messaging was invented in Finland, right? That's how people communicate, right? And so here's this extremely reserved, somewhat, soft-spoken woman who spent, a couple of weeks in this accelerator. And I had this program with her, and I was going through it, and I come back to have one of our sessions, and she's like, well, I've just been thinking, we need to create $1 billion company, because if we don't create $1 billion company, there's no point in doing this. And it was just so funny to see how her mindset had been completely shifted in 2 weeks of just being surrounded by people in the States who just say, look, if you're not willing to create $1 billion company, don't even bother. It's not even worth it. I've
even heard like the 100 billion now. Like the Andreessen won't even take a call with you if you're not even go for the 100 billion. Like, it's ridiculous, right?
Which on the one hand, I completely get. Look, I grew up in the States, as you can tell from my accent. So I was born and raised there. So I was imbued with this concept of you can be anything you put your mind to. But I think there is a big challenge adapting that mindset to Europe, where I think, first of all, people are somewhat more reserved, but also it does create this insane standard to meet, right? There are a lot of successful entrepreneurs who have not built billion-dollar companies, and success measured in, financial outcomes and an impact on society and, users and stuff. So it's not like the world is going to end if you don't build $1 billion company. I think it's much more about creating a realistic outcome that's within the means of your capabilities, of your resources, and shooting for that. Of course, creating some stretch goals, because that's important. But don't kill yourself if you don't think you can build $1 billion company.
I think it's the democratization of tech and all the social media and everything's out there, right? And if I'm not aiming for the top, what am I even doing out here? If there are people getting multi-billion-dollar exits, why am I going for the tens or hundreds of millions kind of thing? But I 100%, I really do understand the practicality argument.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean, this whole concept of unicorn, right? So $1 billion company. I don't know the exact statistics, but I remember somebody speaking at a conference a year ago saying, there were 34 unicorns minted in Europe last year, but not a single one was minted after exit. It was basically somebody put in enough money where it was valued at $1 billion. So, there's a huge gap between being valued at $1 billion and, actually generating $1 billion worth of equity value. And I can tell you, given what's happened in the last year in the market, those valuations, I'm sure, have gone down significantly.
I think, I remember speaking to a couple of colleagues a few years back about why there was such a difference in mentality between, the US founder, the typical US founder, stereotypical, typical British, European founder. And, I thought it came down to a cultural thing, but he was like, there's also some economic factors involved as well, right? It's like when you're based in the States, you do have a much bigger market at your disposal. So investors do have more money to throw because there's more potential gain at the end of the day. So they're incentivized that, this works. They could outcompete the whole market, and this could be very big. And another point that we've come across quite a lot is that a lot of the money in places like London and big cities in Europe, it's a lot of old money. It's in property. It's people that have, for example, you have this scheme in London called the EIS, Entrepreneurial Investment Scheme, right? So it's to incentivize people to take their money out of property or out of these old forms of capital and put it into new startups and incentivize that through some tax benefits.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think it's so true. There's such a fundamental difference when you've got a market of 350 million people who speak the same language, pay in the same currency. Yeah, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that somebody from Texas and somebody from Boston are the same people. I mean, there are different cultural differences as well, but there still is enough commonality where you can actually create a single product in a single language, speaking to roughly the single type of customer, and create a multi-billion-dollar company in the States. As we know, in Europe, a country, a continent of 750 million people, and speaking 25 odd different languages, with very significant cultural differences, different legal frameworks, different environments. It's just not as easy to do that, and I think that's why, as you rightly say, the expectations for U.S. companies is often that, it's going to be, a much bigger play. And there's also much bigger appetite for risk, right? I mean, you've got a whole ecosystem of people who have exited with significant amounts of money. They've gone through the process. There's a certain amount of, soft pressure, I would say, cultural pressure to put some of that money that you made back into the system, right? So you're investing as an angel investor in these companies. So the whole ecosystem is built to foster bigger plays, and so you don't have as much of a challenge in the U.S. to find money on the back of an idea, very, very seed stage. Whereas in Europe, you're right, you're fighting with people. You're not fighting. You're trying to convince people who've got money in central London real estate, which is delivered a nice return for literally hundreds of years. So why risk it if it's good? So so there's some cultural difference. There's some practical market condition differences. There's a financial attitude difference as well.
Mm-hmm. But Zoltan, to go back from the macro view sort of back down to the micro stuff we were discussing earlier when we were talking about problems. I've heard this framework of known knowns in terms of problems. So if you're selling to a client and they've got a problem that they know about, and then they've got then they've got a known unknown or an unknown unknown. Which types of these problems are the easiest sales for a B2B founder?
Well, I'd say that the problems that are going to be the easiest to sell are the ones that hit the bottom line, right? So what I mean by that is anything that generates additional revenue or saves costs. That's what's going to be easiest for a business-to-business customer to justify, to purchase. Anything that goes out of that, which is, increases efficiency, boosts, engagement, things like that, all very important stuff, but that's classically the nice to have category, right? That's the kind of stuff that's going to be, probably pushed to the wayside when the economic environment isn't so rosy and people are liberal or conservative in the way they're planning. So I always talk and encourage my companies I work with to focus in on bottom line impact, return on investment, and to really position their service as a way to make the company's profitability grow. It's not always easy and it's not always obvious, but I think if you focus on that, you'll find that there's a much bigger interest in getting through to decision makers. Having said that, there's of course very big differences between selling to a big corporation, let's say, or to a SME, for instance.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you say that because I think increasing efficiency, reducing churn, all these like secondary metrics, ultimately they relate back to some form of cost saving or revenue generating, right?
They do, but they're much more difficult to prove.
Right.
It's about getting to the root,
connection.
Right? It's about getting right to the source of what's going on. Yeah.
Exactly. Let's be honest.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, let's be honest. At the end of the day, look, financial managers and owners are motivated at the end of the day to generate a profit, right? That's the purpose of business. And so if anything you can do to help them do that is going to make them, sit up and listen.
And then obviously you work a lot in kind of B2B and SaaS, I'm presuming. I'm sure you've seen kind of a wave of AI startups start coming through and all the buzz about AI and everyone wanting to make some kind of, layer on top of ChatGPT. What have you kind of seen in those trends? And do you think what you've just said applies to it in terms of, AI to kind of save the bottom line, help grow the top line? Because there are certainly strong cases for AI improving productivity, and therefore you can, if you're a content creator, you can get more content out, you can create more revenue, more partnerships, etc. Are there any kind of views you have on there, or perhaps interesting industry takes and where AI can actually really help directly grow the top line or save the bottom line?
Yeah. So obviously, it seems like everybody came back from their winter holidays on January and to find that the ChatGPT had taken over the world. I mean, it was incredible. My LinkedIn feed was just like, ChatGPT. It's died down a little bit now, but it's still very much front and center. Look, I think the AI revolution is real. I think that the application of these different technologies to cold outreach, for instance, to reaching potential customers, to making processes more efficient is real. It's still tough to say, whether this is something that has now gotten so much incredible attention that it's been hyped up to the point where it's unrealistic to think that everything is going to be AI. Think about the Metaverse. Right, a year ago, everybody was talking Metaverse, and it was, that was going to change the world. And now you hear all companies basically laying off literally thousands of people that were working on the Metaverse. Right, so these things tend to come and go. I think for the purposes of AI as a startup idea, absolutely a huge opportunity. So one of the clients I work with is a UK-based company. They provide an AI solution for warehousers, like a logistics solution, where they'll have robots that will scan racks and racks of shelves worth of data, boxes, collect that data, make it accessible in a much easier way. That's definitely about efficiency and cost savings in some ways. So there's opportunities there. As to, how long this is going to go and what this could become, unfortunately, my crystal ball isn't that clear. I don't know, but I'm sure it will have some impact on the overall business environment.
So you're not on the complete kind of dystopian side of the argument where you think, because I'm starting to see that, particularly in the last couple of months. I think, as you know, as you've correctly said, kind of got over the peak of the hype wave in terms of, wow, ChatGPT's here, changing our lives, into like, shit, like, this could actually have real long-term consequences. And obviously the rollout of GPT-4 and people's eyes being open to how powerful these things can be, and the kind of not so encouraging interviews done by the likes of Sam Altman, where he's like, okay, we don't really know how these things work, and like we're not sure where it's going, and you would be mistaken not to be a little bit scared, and all of this stuff. I think it's very interesting to see how this play out in the next kind of 1 to 2 years.
Absolutely. Look, I'm not one of those guys who sits there and kind of creates all sorts of theories about what the future is going to hold. To be honest, I'm much more of a hands-on, kind of get it done type of person. And I think where I see the challenge with AI is, kind of working it back to what I do, which is basically, working on the sales side and helping people, generate additional revenues and sell and market to enterprise customers. I think that you cannot discount the value of personal connection. And I know that might not be a particularly modern or hyped up point of view, but I still believe that at the end of the day, people buy from people. And that personal connection that you create is not something that you're going to be able to replace one for one through robotics and AI. I genuinely don't believe that. If I just think about when I go out and I speak at a conference, I'll get on stage, I'll do my thing, and then inevitably I'll have literally 30 to 40 people come up to me afterwards, saying, hey, that was interesting. Can we talk? All sorts of interesting, engagements. And literally within the space of those 7 minutes, I probably build stronger relationships with real people than, 7 weeks sending out cold emails to a bunch of people hoping that somebody responds, right? So it's difficult to imagine that AI is going to be something that's going to replace the personal touch in selling. I can imagine that it will make the process of outreach more efficient. But at the end of the day, it's going to still have to be about having a very clear, focused offer message that targets a specific problem, creating a structured approach to reaching customers and tracking your performance to see how effective you are. So those aren't going to change just because there's some robotic approach there that's making it easier.
So this is really interesting, Zoltan, because I've heard, I think the same, by the way. I agree, but I'm going to play devil's advocate with an opinion I've heard recently. So I'm speaking to a founder here in India, so I'm currently based here, and he was talking about how much of this, what we've just described, is cultural and how much is biological. Because if you take, the millennial generation and previous, a lot more geared towards communication, social skills, going out, talking, being around people, like spent our childhoods going out, playing in the park. That was a big part of growing up. Whereas if you take the modern younger generations now, they spend a lot more time inside. They spend a lot more time on their phones. Their social circles are almost through games, through the Xbox, PlayStations, on WhatsApp, Instagram, Twitch, whatever other platforms are very popular now, right? So how do we know in 20, 30 years that the same value for one-to-one direct human contact and communication might not change? So I think the question there is like, how much of what we're talking about is biological and how much is cultural?
Well, the short answer is we don't know what's going to happen in 20 years. We can just obviously create sort of theories. Look, I have a 17-year-old daughter, so I have somewhat of an insight into this generation. And it's an interesting insight that she once gave me to try to understand what goes on in the minds of the 17-year-olds these days. She described it as two parallel worlds. There's a world in which you live, which is completely digital, and that's basically on Instagram and whatever the equivalents of that the people are using. And the other is the real world, like school and friends and so on. And it's almost like the two don't intersect. It's like there's two very parallel worlds that exist. And so I think that if anything, this generation is going to be capable of existing in those both of those worlds. I see that the kids these days who don't have the ability to walk into a room and introduce themselves and make an impression are going to be at a disadvantage, because at the end of the day, again, it's still about people and it's still about relationships. And so I just find it hard to believe that personal element is going to completely disappear. I really do. I think there's going to be an efficiency element. I mean, look, even if I think of my generation, I'm 52. if I think of, I've already grew up. I got my first computer when I was 17, right? So already I was, quite late compared to today, where kids have their computers when they're 3. About using a computer and using word processing and doing all that stuff. So in comparison to, let's say, my parents' generation, but I would say that there's definitely still a value to the personal touch. And I don't think people who are going to rely entirely on digital communication, digital world are going to flourish. And interestingly, if there's anything a proof to that, it's this metaverse concept, which of course a year ago was Mark Zuckerberg's big, revolutionary idea. It's hard to say, but I think it's generally been rejected because people don't want to live in a completely virtual world, right? I mean, the whole concept of just living with, glasses on and not having any personal connection with people just is a bit creepy, I think.
Yeah, there is the
I mean, don't you think?
I completely agree. Yeah, I'm on the same page.
I think I'm on the same page as well, because as you know, like we're all sociable people. We love going out, meeting people, talking to people face to face. I think there is the argument, for example, with the smartphone. I understand like the proto smartphone kind of came out in the 90s, and the world wasn't ready for it and the technology wasn't ready for it. That might be, as again, to play devil's advocate, might be something we're seeing with the metaverse. It may be something that comes into play 10, 20 years down the line. But I think, kind of to echo your point, is like technology has always been a tool for mankind. Like we've always used it to help better ourselves, and as the famous quote, to give us superpowers, to enhance ourselves, really. I would say that the only thing is now we're kind of reaching that inflection point where people are starting to think that it's clear to us that AI has the power to kind of flip the switch. And I think to kind of, reiterate your point is whether we're ready to accept that, and whether we will now, which I doubt we will, but maybe in the next 10 to 20 years, we might be in a position where we're like, oh, actually, it's some kind of Wall-E dystopian world where we're willing to let AI actually kind of usurp all areas of our lives.
So here's a bit of perspective. You guys live in an extremely high tech world. You're talking to people like me and founders and so on, and I do as well. So I'm out of a generation where I'm, a lot of my friends and colleagues, are still in the corporate world. They're still sort of in that more traditional environment, and ChatGPT kind of hit my my LinkedIn feed kind of early January. And I was chatting with some of my close friends, also the sort of similar aged executives in the world, about 2 weeks ago. They'd never even heard of it. Literally had never even heard of it. And these are senior executives at big companies. And what that made me realize is that, what an interesting bubble you live in if you're in this, the forward-facing technology side. And you think that the entire world is talking about ChatGPT, but actually it's just a tiny portion of the world that actually knows it exists. And a lot of people, and I'm not talking about people living in small towns and, farming. I'm talking about like, big city people living in, big houses, living in, making a decent wage at big companies, haven't heard of it. Right. I mean, I was sitting there at the table while we were having a beer, explaining what it was and showing them how we could put in anything into the phone and it would write this poem about it. And they were like, oh my God, that's insane. Like, how long has this existed? So to that point, I think that, yes, this AI stuff is important, but I also think it's still impacting just a tiny sliver of people in the world. And it's going to be a long time before it trickles down to the broader population.
Zoltan, is so true, because when I worked in banking for a couple of years, and I saw that exact phenomenon, like people just living life with blinders on, had no clue what was going on in the outside world. It was all work, work, work. How can I add value to my company? Not even how can I add value to myself and grow my own skills? It never had that kind of outlook. It was always, how can I add value to my company, to my bosses? How can I help? And, from night kind of day till your night, always thinking about the company and living in your own bubble of whatever it is, banking or law or whatever your practice area was. And I think that is something unique in the tech ecosystem, that it's not just you're siphoned off in B2B SaaS and this kind of little niche that you're doing. Is you, by showing you are an entrepreneur, you're thinking bigger anyway, and your mind is always on, what's the next technology, where can I go to next? It just shows that kind of very entrepreneurial mindset that a lot of people don't share, frankly, especially if you're in a big corporation.
Yeah. And it's such a tiny sliver, right? I mean, it's literally, you're talking about a few percentage points. I mean, I think it's probably less than 1% of the world that even knows what ChatGPT is. I really genuinely think so. I think it's about, obviously the segment of the world is much, that is probably, opinion leaders and high tech and all that stuff, but it's still a small sliver. So I think, it's gonna be a long time before this trickles down into everyday people's lives. Having said that, if you can capture the power of AI, and apply it to your business, I think it's a huge benefit. Although, speaking from experience, right now, obviously in my own work, I'm looking at how can I introduce AI into my outreach and my work. And it's confusing, man. I mean, there's just so much stuff out there. And, yeah, you can read the 75th LinkedIn post about the 5 steps to using ChatGPT in your outreach, but it's still very difficult to apply, right? I mean, you still have to go through the process and learn it and all that stuff. So, there's a big gap between the theory and the practice.
And ultimately, you got to change habits. I think that's the strongest thing, right? People are averse to that. If you have a workflow, you have a structure, you're more comfortable sticking that, and especially if it works. Why the heck would you change?
Yeah, exactly. And habits are hard to create. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So I wanted to ask on the sales side again. Whenever you have young founders come to you, what's the most common problem they have with establishing a proper sales pipeline?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it starts with what problem they're solving. It goes a little bit back to an early part of our discussion. It really is interesting to me how even companies that have been around for 3-4 years will sometimes have a very difficult time explaining articulate way, like what is it they actually do. And I'll give you a specific example. So one of the early companies I worked with was in the area of social media analytics. That basically they analyze literally millions and millions of messages and social media messages and emails and stuff, and then they create this kind of picture of what the true intent of a particular type of consumer is towards a product, right? So they sell this product to pharmaceutical companies, to telecommunications companies, with large groups of consumers. And I saw these guys, I think they were about 2 years old, got to chatting, and I was like, so explain to me what you guys do. And it turned into this typical 5-minute monologue with all these buzzwords and all this stuff. And I'm like, no, listen, I'm a 12-year-old. Explain to me what is it you do. Well, they couldn't really do it. We started working together. And so we explained, I've got this kind of 5-step process to create a 1-sentence value proposition, and we went through that process, and it was really interesting. You go through the process, and it forces you to simplify a lot of things, and it create this 1 sentence literally that hopefully a 12-year-old can understand. And once they got that right, it was interesting how it impacted the entire organization, because suddenly, because they could articulate what they were actually doing, their product development became much more clear, because they actually knew what they needed to do in order to solve for that value proposition. All of a sudden, the organization, the way where they're communicating with the rest of the team, people are like, okay, so that's what I'm doing. All right, well, now I get it. So then I'm going to do that. And it was really interesting. The physical impact of this is once you go through this process and you clarify your message, people see the physical impact of it, because all of a sudden they're like, their face relaxes, their shoulders sag. They're like, okay, finally, I understand what I'm actually selling. I always knew what I was selling, but I could never really explain it. So that's kind of the first thing that I always work on, is like, get your value proposition so clear that in 8 seconds you can explain what problem you solve for who and why you're better than the competition. Once you do that, then that opens up the question of, how do you create a pipeline? And that starts with the ideal customer profile, or your ICP, right? So you have to really clearly articulate who is it that is most likely to be interested in what you're selling. And I always emphasize most likely, because the typical startup approach is, well, this is good for everything, and I always say, look, if you're everything to everybody, then you're nothing to nobody, right? You've got to be not a solution for something, you have to be the perfect solution for that one thing, right? And so really identifying the type of customer who's going to really look at you as the best possible solution for his particular problem. And there's a process for doing that, right? I mean, if you're selling business to business, you start with a company. What does the company look like? What are the empirical elements? Industry, size, geographic location, right? Like, you can go through all those pieces. And then you say, okay, what are the things that are softer interest? Are you looking for companies that are open to innovation? Are you interested in companies that are, like quality over quantity? I mean, there's all sorts of different factors. Once you've created that clear profile of the company, then you have to go into, okay, so who are the people that are going to make decisions, right? Who's got the budget and the authority to make a decision? And then again, you start going through that process. Like, what are the titles that they're going to have? What are the industries they're in? What are the roles they have? And then once you've identified that, then that's where actually the work begins, which is basically, how do you reach out to these people, go through the process of outreach and contacting and selling. But you have to get those first 2 things right: ideal customer profile and your value proposition, before you even get started.
What you said about really having the messaging into the internal stakeholders really reminds me of books I've read on branding. When you start a brand, it's like, have the messaging of your brand completely clear, so that everyone that joins immediately knows what they're coming into and what environment and what kind of company you're trying to create. Sounds extremely similar to that.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting things is, it's not like it happens like this, right? I mean, you can go through the process in a bubble. You can create some sort of theoretical approach, but then you have to take it out to the market. You've got to test it in your conversations with people. You've got to test it in your emails. You've got to test it in your outreach, your messaging, your website, right? So there's a lot of stuff. And, inevitably something's not going to be, maybe the key benefit you have is not really the most important thing for your target customer, or maybe your competitive advantage isn't how you deliver the solution, but it's actually another benefit, right? There's different scenarios there. And you have to go through that pain of iteration before you ultimately realize that you've got it right. And you'll know you've got it right because three things happen. First of all, your sales cycle shortens significantly, right? So people are just getting to yes much quicker. Second, you'll get much fewer objections, right? So people aren't raising as many questions about why this is something that should work for them. And the third is you just simply start getting a lot more inbound interest, right? Because people are reacting to what it is because you're speaking to their problem. And once you have that, I mean, it's a beautiful thing, right? That's when you start really, really scaling. And then it's not just about, finding the right process. It's like just being much more efficient about implementing the process.
I guess one thing that comes to, because when you say people are inbound coming, it's because it's easily comprehensible. Straight off the bat, you're like, I know exactly what that is and I want it. But also when you're selling, it's like, I have clear messaging. So if you don't want it, I'm going to get a no a lot faster. So I don't have to dedicate those resources.
Absolutely. And saying no is one of the toughest things, right? Especially when you're selling, right? The concept of just saying, okay, so actually I've got a great solution, but this is not the problem I solve for. And just being able to say no. Typical situation I have is, a company I'll work with will say, yeah, but if we just focus on these people, then we're going to miss all these other people. I said, but that's fine because all these other people are probably not, they don't need you. These people really need you. So focus your efforts on finding these type of people. But it does create this fear of missing out, right? So you kind of got to get over that. And it's a process. I mean, look, selling's not easy. It's a tough process. You have to understand that you have to go through a lot of pain before you experience the pleasure, so to speak.
It's a very psychological process. Like even adapting your mind to rejection, self-discipline, maintaining structure. I was speaking to a sales manager and he was saying exactly what you said. Well, on the same lines, he was talking about he creates an ICP, really understands his customers, and then before he actually goes onto a demo call, before he tries to sell anything, he'll speak to the customer first to see if they really fit the ICP. So they might come into him inbound and say, hey, this is really interesting. We'd love to have a look at what you're doing. And then he kind of speaks to them first for a 10-15-minute call. And from that call, we'll discern whether or not they fit the ICP. And if they don't, he'll actually turn around and say, hey guys, I'm really happy to help you find the best product available on the market, but I don't think what we have is for you. And this is why.
Yeah.
And that takes great discipline.
And a very powerful statement to say. And, of course, it also sometimes gets people to say, oh, well, actually, maybe I do really need it, right? So it's an interesting psychology. Once you say you don't need, you want somebody, then all of a sudden they want you more. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it works the same way in investment. Just sorry to cut you off there, because it's like you go to most founders and they're like, oh yeah, take my business card. Let's talk. I'd love to come in and pitch to you. And then you go to a particular founder who's already funded, and they say, you listen to what their business does, and you're like, oh, when are they going to ask me to have a meeting? And then they're like, oh, well, we're not actually looking for funding, so it's good. It's nice to meet you. And then you're like, I need to invest in that company.
It is. One of the things that resonated with me that you said, that sales is really tough. And, so one of the things that I experience regularly is, the founders that I work with mostly are tech founders, right? So they're people who are not, sales and marketing is not their comfort zone. They're product people, they're tech people. And what I found oftentimes is that they're really scared of selling, and not just because of the rejection, just because they don't understand the process, right? I mean, a lot of, product folks are really structured in the way that they develop things. And so that's when I realized that in order to get these type of founders to accept that sales is possible is to create a very clear blueprint, like a step-by-step process that they can follow. And so I found that to be extremely powerful in the way that I approach with the launch code, is that I give these founders like a paint by numbers type of approach of like, how do you actually create the fundamentals of sales and marketing? And it's amazing the impact it has, because a very recent story, just I think last week, I'm working with a tech founder who runs a development company. And, he's doing deals in the 5,000-6,000 euro range in terms of his average customer value or contract value, short-term kind of things. And, we just got down to the whole process. Okay, so what's your value proposition? Why are you different than the other 75 different development companies out there? What is it that people can buy? Like, what are the three options they can buy? Option A, option B, option C. how are you going to present this message so you don't talk about yourself? Because frankly, nobody cares about who you are. They care about what problem you solve, right? Like we just started ticking these things off. And he calls me, I don't know, we had one of our sessions, and he says, I just sold this package that I've been selling for 5,000 euros for 10,000 euros. And I said, well, what did you change about it? I said, literally nothing. So you're saying you sold the exact same thing you've been selling for 5,000 for 10,000. Is it different type of company? No, exact same type of customer. What did you do differently? He said, I just presented my offer in a much more compelling way. And it was just such an interesting insight to say, it's like, it's not rocket science, but it's just, if you get those fundamentals right, you can literally charge twice as much for the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Simply because your customers will believe that what you offer is relevant to them. It's
the beauty and nuance of human communication. Maintaining particular types of frame and creating certain communicative environments. It's like you see it even in going to a new job, applying for a new job, anywhere we're communicating with another person, based on how you say it and how you approach the conversation changes the whole frame of it.
Yeah. And Zoltan, I imagine you've seen before as well, sorry to cut you off, that people just start pouring money into the sales team as well at that point. And they're like, oh no, we're going to go out and hire 10, 20, 30 salespeople. It's like, well, you could have just done this in one evening if you tweaked your positioning slightly and your returns would have been like this.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, once you get that right, that's when you can start scaling, which of course is an important step. But I think one of the biggest mindset shifts for me that I notice in people is just the concept of the idea here is not to talk about yourself. It's about talking about your customer and understanding the problem they have and how you solve it. That's such a mind shift difference. So many times you go on a website and it's just like me. This is what I do. This is why I'm good. This is why our product is good. This is how many awards we've gotten. All great, but what is it that I should actually what are you going to do for me? Right? That's what a customer wants to know. And so when they go to a website, that's got to be the message. What's the problem you solve? Good example of this, I worked with a company out of Poland that sells a tech tool to audit factory manufacturing processes in automotive companies. And again, very typical, we go to his website, me, this is what we do. And I'm like, look, why are factory managers going to be interested in what you're offering? Well, actually, our studies show that we can reduce the time of these factory audits by 70%. So I'm saying you're going to save these people 70% of their time. Why isn't that at the top of your website? And that's what we did. We said, save 70% of your time. And, I don't know what the exact language was, but something like, save 70% of your time and sleep well, that your factory audits are doing well. And he immediately closed a couple of new deals in Germany for companies he never had any contact with by just simply changing the messaging and making it about his customer and not about himself.
That's very insightful. It's so insightful.
I imagine you see that loads with tech guys as well, because we've seen this definitely. It's like once you're a tech person, you've coded something from scratch. Essentially, it's your baby and you're kind of married to it. And you want to kind of project it out in the world, kind of tying in the points we just made here about not thinking about what the customer actually wants and kind of projecting what you would like, and then not getting the messaging right and, centering it more about yourself. So that's a great lesson. I believe that people should learn that for themselves. And I would hope that, when they speak to you as well, it's not just you're kind of like a partner with them and you kind of hold their hand through it, but they eventually get to a point where it's like, I'm comfortable that I can now go out and sell and continue to scale by myself as a founder.
Absolutely. And that's, look, I teach these guys how to fish. I don't fish for them. And that is a fundamental part of what I offer, right? I give them the tools they need to do it themselves because, I can't scale myself. Unfortunately, the two things I haven't been able to solve for is there are only 24 hours in the day and there's only one of me. So, I've got to figure out a different way to provide value. And that's why I launched my online course as well. So if somebody wants to access the content, they can do it, on demand version, or if they want to do the whole program with me, that's a possibility. If there's a mix option there as well, if they want to buy the program, they get 5 hours of mentoring with me. So there's different options they can use, but it is about teaching the founders to become comfortable with selling and ultimately, of course, at some stage reaching the point where they can maybe hire a professional sales person and then, professional sales team in-house to build their business.
No, absolutely. Zoltan, I want to go back as well to something you said at the start. You started your own company, and then you exited. You said you maybe had multiple exits. Can you maybe shed light on that? Because, we don't get a lot of, more experienced entrepreneurs that have had exits in the past, and yourself particularly having gone through the dot-com bubble and kind of what the environment was like that 20 years ago. Maybe just shed light on your experiences there.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was 23 years ago, 1999. I was at the heart of the entire internet explosion. So I was working in Los Angeles. I was a VP of sales for CBS television in Los Angeles, surrounded by a bunch of 20 somethings. I was 28 at the time, I think. and started by 20-somethings who were just leaving these companies to start up, the first .com companies. And companies like Google and Yahoo and eBay were a couple of years old, right? So this is like really, really the golden age or the stone age of the internet, depending on your perspective. And so I left my job. I partnered up with my brother actually, and we raised $1.5 million of angel investment in $50,000 increments. On the back of this concept of creating the Yahoo for Central and Eastern Europe. So I've got a Hungarian background. I live partly in Budapest and partly in London. And so I moved from Los Angeles to Budapest and we started this business. And, it was like, it was just a wild ride. I mean, it was about a 24-month experience. It felt like 24 years. You go into this experience thinking that, well, you got the plan, you got the business plan, you got the investors, perfect, everything's going to go. And then like reality hits, right? And then you're like, oh man, I got to get the customers. I got to convince my investors. I got to deal with this. The head of content just quit. I got to replace them. It's just like the day-to-day grind of just creating a business is insane, right? And so we went through that whole process, and we actually were able to catch the wave and exited pretty well from that to some strategic investors. And so what I learned from that experience is really that this concept of entrepreneurship is really a combination of two things. Get it done and execution is absolutely important and critical. And some people say it's 95% execution, 5% planning. I actually think you actually have to do some planning as well, right? So just going in there and like a bull in a china shop to build something is not necessarily the most effective way to do it. And so I really think that you have to have a certain amount of structure and planning to the process to give you those guidelines, and then the execution becomes extremely important because you're putting your effort and your resources into the right things rather than just kind of going randomly. So that was my kind of first entrepreneurial experience. I actually went back after the exit, and back in the corporate world, and eventually became CEO for a large broadcasting group in Central Europe, and then eventually moved to NBC to become senior vice president of global sales there. But during that period, I had a two years shot where I left again the corporate world, and I put some money into some early stage companies. And so one of the exits that we had was a company called Brainient, actually a UK based company in the ad tech space. I worked with the founder there, a very talented guy named Emmy Gall, and worked with him at a board level to build the company, and eventually exited to a company called Teads, which is a French ad tech company. And so, there again, it was a really interesting ride, seeing, the importance of constant iteration, of constantly, adjusting your messaging to meet the needs of the customer, and building some strategic partnerships, which ultimately led to the exit. Because one of the reasons we got the exit was through a strategic partnership with ITV in the UK, which was very successful. So I've kind of had those, and I'm currently now chairman of a company called Ontavo. Ontavo is a loyalty tech platform. They work with multinational companies, helping them build loyalty programs, providing the technology behind it, and have customers like KFC in the UK and BMW and some major fashion brands. And I've worked with those guys for many years. I was an early investor, and now as a chairman. And I also see there the importance of persistence, right? Just of sticking with it and of pushing through the difficult times. So a lot of interesting experiences on the entrepreneurial side to match my kind of corporate background.
So Zoltan, do you then invest in the companies or mentor, or how do you structure your relationships with the upcoming entrepreneurs apart from the sales program you do, of course?
Yeah. So the primary focus of my professional efforts are as an advisor. So I work with early stage founders, providing them this kind of launch code program, which I offer through a personal mentoring program, an on-demand course, and a combination of the two. That's the brunt of my work, and I get a professional fee for that, so I don't take any equity or anything like that. That's the service I provide. Separately from that, the company, like for instance, Ontavo, where I'm the chairman, I'm actually an early investor in the company as well. So I've put some money in there, and we raised about a 10 million euro around 6 months ago. So there's some institutional investors that came in there. So I've followed that along. So I'd say that it's 90% professional service and then 10% more investment into companies that where I have kind of some sort of operational involvement.
And how do you find those companies in terms of the angel investment? Is it just through people mentioning to you like, hey, Zoltan, I think this would be interesting, why don't you have a look? And then it's like, hey, this is actually quite cool. Have you dropped some money in this?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I'm not haven't been very active in the last few years as an angel investor. So some of these investments I made sort of 5-6 years ago, and they've come to fruition now. Right now, I'm not really looking at angel investment opportunities, but I would say that there's always an openness, right? You never know. I try to create a wall between my professional services and my investment profile, frankly, because it can be quite confusing. Like if you're an investor, then what are you doing because you're protecting your money, and what is it that you're offering as a professional service? So I try to kind of keep those separate from each other. But yeah, if there are B2B tech founders out there who kind of are struggling with sales and they need support to build this recurring revenue stream, then I'd love to talk to them.
What I love, Zoltan, is the kind of point you somewhat implied, which is something that we've heard from entrepreneurs in the past as well, which is like, you go into entrepreneurship and founding a company thinking, oh, I'm going to be so free now. I finally get to pursue what I want. But it almost immediately turns into shackles, right? And you immediately, it's like, oh my God, all these calls from investors, from customers, from my employees, like shit. And then, you can even burn out even faster than you would do in the corporate world. So I really appreciate actually the candidness of that statement.
Yeah, I'll tell you, one of the greatest fallacies in business is, I'm going to create my own company because I want to be my own boss. That I think is literally, whoever came up with that was high on something. I mean, look, if you commit to building a company, absolutely do it, but only do it if you are absolutely, positively passionate about the problem that you want to solve. You are prepared to put yourself through unbelievable amounts of stress and pressure and just have the internal fortitude to push through. If you don't, or if you're not that type of character, save yourself the trouble, because it's just so much more work than you ever thought. And it will take you 2 to 3 times longer than you think. And that's like a standard conclusion I've come to. Like if you think it's a 3-year project, it's going to take you 6 to 9 years, 100%. And I think, and I don't say that to scare people off. I just think it's really important that you be clear on what you're getting yourself into. And that's why I have such respect for entrepreneurs who start something, who build it, who are able to become successful, whether it's financially or in terms of their impact, because it is such a massive undertaking.
And I think it's something we're seeing. You make excellent points, and it's like you look at the bull run for basically the last kind of 10 years before the pandemic, and everyone's kind of getting on this hype train, this building, and the allure of being an entrepreneur has never been higher. And everyone's kind of finding all these little niches and sub niches of like businesses they can build. And now I think there's this huge reset obviously happening right now, particularly in the Western world, where people are actually evaluating, okay, what big problems do I want to solve? Where do I want to spend my time in the next 10, 20 years of my life? I think that's kind of coinciding with, people, of your daughter's generation, for example, from my little sister's generation, who actually see, bigger problems. What a big one would be climate, that they're actually dedicated to kind of solving. And it's like, oh, I want to dedicate my life for this. And a lot of deep tech founders that I meet now, you look at their kind of CVs and it's like, wow, you've been working on something like this for the last 10 years. And that's crazy. And you did your PhD 10 years ago and you've been working on this problem this whole time. And you only just secured like 500K in grant funding and you've been working on it for 10 years. And then you realize the motivation isn't, I want to be an entrepreneur. The motivation was, deep down within you. And it's like, I love the problem that I'm solving. And I have a passion for it.
Yeah. And by the way, I think one thing that is really creating this hype and this misconception about entrepreneurship is a lot of this stuff you see on Instagram, mostly of these 20-something guys with orange Lamborghinis and the rent-a-model girlfriend, with a flashy watch. Telling you, I mean, it actually drives me crazy. I mean, I think those are so misleading, and there's it's this hustle culture crap about, work 6 weeks, 2 hours a day for 6 weeks and you'll be driving a Lamborghini. And they're selling some system to do that. And I just think it's so misleading because first of all, it makes it seem like it's easy. Second of all, a lot of what's behind this is you don't have to educate yourself. You don't have to work hard. You don't have to train yourself. It's just, you have to find the hack that's going to make you a millionaire. And I think it's so misleading and it's so fundamentally wrong. And unfortunately, it also creates this ridiculous expectation for a lot of founders that they're going to be driving Lamborghinis in a year, which all power to them if they want to drive a Lamborghini, but if that's what they want to spend their money on. But just presenting that as the desired outcome for me is just so wrong. It's just so out of whack with what the reality is.
downright contemptuous towards the public and the younger generation, right?
It is, and that's what they're reading. That's what it's saying. You know, I get these things
They feed off that as well. They make money
Absolutely.
off people's desire to do that,
Yeah,
and it's
exactly.
also like it plays on this trend of instant gratification. Like, hey, you don't have to work for anything anymore. Just get it right
exactly.
now.
Yeah, and there's this really strong. I read from your bios. You guys are both Imperial College graduates. I went to Cornell, so I think we're all kind of in that space where we spent some time with our education and and put some time into it. I really have a problem with all this messaging about college is useless and education is crap, and I think again it's completely wrong. The ability to think critically, the ability to surround yourself with like-minded people who have ambition, who want to make something of themselves, I think far outweighs an extra couple of years of sitting there and doing your hacks and your quick wins. I think I personally think that as whether you're not, I mean, obviously if you're a doctor or lawyer, you kind of have to go to college. But if you're an entrepreneur, I think you have a huge benefit if you put the time in, because you learn to solve problems, which is basically what entrepreneurship is all about. You learn to work with others. You surround yourself with people who can be inspiring for you. And give you that. I mean, you guys are college classmates, I guess, as well, right? So you guys have spent a lot of time together, and I think it's such a value, such a value for anybody.
Absolutely, and it's like if you study something that's technical, you surround yourself with people that become sector experts. You might not necessarily become one if that's not what you want to do, but like a lot of your friends that you study with might go on to do PhDs and become the people that know, because most innovation comes from the universities. It comes from the university about 10, 15 years before, and then it starts slowly seeping into the commercial world.
That's a whole nother podcast we could do about how the UK system is completely messed up and sells every kind of spin out founder short. I mean, it's actually embarrassing. Like, we don't have enough time now, but the amount of equity they take off ideas, spun out of universities is actually abhorrent. And the whole, UK startup ecosystem is really in the kind of mud at the moment, frankly. But yeah, we could maybe talk about that on the second episode. But I want to segue as well into what you were kind of saying about kind of a very clear kind of what you put in is what you get out. There's no shortcuts and hacks to life. And I feel that very much that way about fitness as well. And I kind of saw that you just did your Spartan race, your second one.
Yeah.
If I'm not your seventh one, if I'm not mistaken.
Seventh one. Yeah. Seventh one. Yeah.
Sorry, I said second because, 7 is, not even believable, frankly. But what made you do it? Was this kind of like a challenge you're setting yourself, or is it, a lifelong passion you've had and you're like, finally, now's the time I can get it done? Or
So the story is that it was the Christmas of 2017, and I looked in the mirror and I just said, God, I got to get into shape. And basically it was one of those fortuitous things where I was, 2 seconds later, I was flipping through Facebook and there was a Spartan Race ad. And I was like, okay, that's it. I'm going to do it. So I literally clicked on it. It was April of 2018. And then I said, I'm going to train for it. So I found a trainer, just an insane guy who prepares people to take part in these races. Not somebody I'd like to hang out with, but he brought out the most of me. And I got into shape. Really, I mean, he was like a drill sergeant type of character.
I know the type. Yeah.
Yeah. So he brought the best out of me, and I did it, and I was extremely proud of myself. And then subsequent to that, I started doing them, and unfortunately, I took a break because of COVID, because they canceled a bunch of races in 2020. I was going to do the trifecta, which is there's the 7 kilometer, 14 kilometer, 25 kilometer. I was going to do all 3. I've just done 2 of those. I didn't do the top one. And so yeah, it's something for me that is about giving yourself, stretching your comfort zone. I mean, we live, we all work in kind of white collar environments. You sit in front of a computer all day, and people have become basically pretty lazy. I mean, they're pretty mushy and soft and lazy. And I think, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations actually enables you to take on a lot of other stuff that have nothing to do with your fitness, right? If you just kind of push through thing. I mean, literally in this race, the last obstacle, I had this insane leg cramp, like just out of the blue. I could barely stand. And I'm just sitting there and I'm thinking, man, if I don't do this obstacle, I'm going to have to do another 30 burpees. So I literally mustered every ounce of energy I had and did the last obstacle. It was like one of these ring things. And I did it. And, you feel good, feel good about yourself. It's funny. I had the opportunity to interview the guy who founded Spartan, Joe DeSena. I have a podcast as well. And the way he explained it to me, he said, what we do is we give people the opportunity to feel like an Army Ranger for a day. or like an Olympic athlete for a day. They've got the whole show, right? You go through the finish line, they put a big heavy medal around your neck. They give you that feeling, and that's what it is. It's an extremely inspiring, powerful thing, and keeps you in shape. So there's a benefit, from a health standpoint, but it's also something that kind of feel like you did something that was outside of your comfort zone. So I encourage everybody to try it. It's fun.
Excellent messaging as well, what you just said there. I love his like one-liner about what it's all about. That really encapsulates it. Instead of saying, oh, you're going to do an obstacle course, you're going to do that, it's like, we'll make you feel like an army ranger for a day. That's absolutely fantastic. Zoltan, I don't know how much more time you have, but it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Do you have 5 more minutes, or you need to jump off?
Absolutely. I'm happy. Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to chat.
Well, Zoltan, I just want to know, with the Spartan races, what does it involve?
So a Spartan race is basically, it's an obstacle course race. They are at different levels. And there's kind of 7 kilometer, I'm going to use round number, 7 kilometer, 15 kilometer, 25 kilometer races. And each of them has a set number of obstacles. The obstacles are a combination of skill. So you got to like climb a wall, or you got to do, these rings where you got to go from one to the next. There's heavy, like you got to, you got to pull like a 50 kilo weight up a pole. You got to pick up this huge cement ball and carry it. So it's kind of like strength stuff. And then there's kind of muddy stuff, like you got to go through barbed wire and mud, and kind of gets you got to go into water. Sometimes you have to go underwater to catch something. So they create this set of obstacles over the course of the race, and if you don't do the obstacle, you have to do 30 burpees. And I don't know if you know what a burpee is. It's basically when you jump down, you do a push up, and you jump back up. So you have to do 30 of those.
Those are brutal.
And they're pretty brutal. I mean, 30 is doable, but like when you're doing your third times 30, then it gets to be pretty tiring. And of course, what they do is they usually put these races on very high elevation. So like the first 3 kilometers of the race I just did was straight up, like it was literally a 45-degree angle up a mountain. So they tire you out at the beginning, then they give you a bunch of stuff to do, and then at the last kilometer, they just put obstacle after obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, like right after the next. And so what you end up doing is, unfortunately, if you don't do the obstacle, you don't do the burpees, but they just like really pound you, right? So because you have to do the burpees, then you go to immediately the next obstacle. If you don't do it, then you got to do burpees. I usually have about 3-4 mistakes over the course of one race. So I have to do about 90 to 120 burpees. And so basically it's a test of your physical fitness, but also of your will, because these obstacles are all doable. Like they're not impossible, but they're doable. And you just have to sometimes really reach deep. I mean, it's literally, it's like one of these almost animalistic type of things where you're like sitting there, it's like, I got to do it. Like I had to do the rope climb. I was so tired. I'm like, man, I mean, I've done this gym so many times. I'm like, and it's all muddy, right? So they make it really muddy. So all the ropes are really muddy and stuff. And you're like jumping and you're slipping down. And I'm just like sitting there like, I am not leaving here until I do this obstacle. And I literally just dug deep and I did it. So again, there's a kind of an interesting psychology to it. And the whole thing, Joe started this whole thing on the back of him, he liked these endurance races, but he just didn't have, he didn't have enough of a challenge. So he wanted to create something that, kind of gave him this challenge, and he built this entire business. They have something like 400 or 500 races a year globally now. So it's a really big business.
That's fantastic.
It's a massive thing. You should try it out, SCA. I know you're out of shape at the moment. You need to get back into it.
Yeah. Basically, if to get into shape, you do CrossFit. Like it's that type of thing, and you have to do running. Like those are the 2 things you have to do in order to get in shape.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, constant sort of muscular endurance activities. Yeah. Cardio.
Yeah. I love the point you kind of started out with, which is you're kind of getting into it and you're seeing the dual-sided benefits of fitness. Like I've been a fitness fanatic my whole life, and I think a lot of people that aren't into fitness always look at it and say kind of it's a zero-sum game. Like you're kind of taken away from the other aspects of your life if you're spending so much time in the gym, on the track, on the bars, whatever kind of workouts you may be doing. Yeah. And I completely disagree with them. I'm like, you don't know what this has done for, my mental state just as at a baseline. It's very hard when you're going, 6 days a week training, the level of endorphins you're experiencing, the level of productivity that you have throughout the day if you go in the morning, and how that carries through into everything else you're doing. And that's why I don't want to push it on people, but I really suggest to them just at least try to work out 2 times a week. Try and just elevate your heart rate. Because as you say, we spend so much time sitting in front of our laptops and not doing enough, and you will see see the knock-on effects. Okay, the first 2 weeks are going to be painful as hell. We all know this. You're going to get muscular pains. You're going to feel like you want to tap out, but you're going to see this kind of like J curve where you'll start to reap the benefits in months and down the line. And it's really important you do so, especially when you don't have as many kind of commitments and you get too old and it starts to hurt a bit more and all of this, right? Just trying to get started young and kind of build those habits.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I start my day every day with a 1-hour workout. So, speaking to the choir in that sense, and I think it's such a huge impact. But look, it's like anything. If you want to do it, you have to make time for it. I mean, it's there's no magic fix. Unfortunately, you will not collect an orange Lamborghini for not working out. It's just you have to put in the time. I mean, it's just. I'm
starting to think you want a Lamborghini. You brought it up a number of times.
I do not. No. I have a very conservative sedan, Volkswagen sedan. So I'm not there. But no, for me, that's just the typical thing you always see in these ads, right? Because it's that's, or maybe it's lime green. I don't know if it's orange or lime green, but one of those two.
Maybe both these days. You see maybe hideous liveries out there. But Zoltan, it's been a fantastic episode. Absolute pleasure meeting you and speaking to you. I really hope we can do this again as well. So do let us know if you're free in the coming months.
Absolutely. And if it's okay, I just want to make an opportunity or an offer to everybody's listening. First of all, I love the conversation. Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. Anybody out there who's listening, kind of business to business tech founder who's struggling with sales, who wants to build kind of this predictable revenue stream. As I mentioned, one of the first things I do is I start out with this 5-step process that I share with the founders to create this value proposition. And it's the lowest hanging fruit, right? It's basically what you can do. And so what I want to do is I want to share this process with listeners. So if they go to zoltanvardy.com/podcast, zoltanvardy.com/podcast, then they can access this free value proposition video guide I created. They can watch the video, they can do the exercise, and they can do it themselves. And hopefully it adds value to them. And if they find that it's something that they want to talk to me about, I can be reached either directly through the guide or just on LinkedIn. So just wanted to make that offer.
No, absolutely. And we'll put it in the show notes as well. And
okay. Fantastic. All right, guys. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Zoltan. Take care.
Cheers.
Have a great week.
All the best.